In general, we all understand that a soldier's primary duty is to fight the enemy. The risk of injury or death on the battlefield usually comes from enemy attacks, whether bullets or bombs. However, the history of the United States military holds a different and quite surprising fact. For thousands of American soldiers, the greatest danger came not from foreign enemies, but from the orders of their own superiors. For decades, the United States military ran a series of secret programs. In these programs, soldiers' bodies were used as research subjects. It's important to remember that these soldiers were not prisoners, but citizens on duty. Without adequate protection, and often without clear information, they were used as test subjects for chemical and biological weapons. These programs lasted for quite a long time and involved a wide variety of experiments, from spraying bacteria on warships to testing skin resistance to poison gas. The primary rationale behind these actions was national security and preparation for war. However, their implementation often neglected the safety and health of the soldiers themselves. In this video, we'll discuss how these dangerous experiments occurred and why they were covered up for so many years.
To understand the origins of this program, we must go back to World War II. At the time, U.S. military officials were deeply concerned that Germany and Japan would use chemical weapons on the battlefield, as they had in World War I. The U.S. government felt the need to prepare its troops for a poison gas attack. However, this preparation turned into one of the most controversial medical experiments in military history. The U.S. War Department recruited approximately 60,000 soldiers to be used as test subjects for chemical agents, primarily mustard gas and lewisite. Mustard gas is a chemical that works by damaging body cells, causing severe burns in the form of large blisters on the skin, temporary blindness, and permanent damage to the respiratory tract. The testing methods were very specific and dangerous. There were two main methods used. The first was the gas chamber test. Soldiers wearing gas masks and protective clothing were placed in a sealed chamber. The chamber was then filled with mustard gas. The goal was to test how long the equipment could withstand the gas's penetration. However, soldiers were often ordered to remove their masks inside the chamber to test human physical resistance to the gas. The second method was the patch test. In this method, pure mustard gas was dripped directly onto the skin of soldiers' arms. The goal was to see how quickly burns appeared and how severe the damage was. Behind this brutal method, there was a more specific fact that was rarely known to the public until the documents were declassified in the 1990s and early 2000s. These experiments were not randomized, but rather segregated by race. Military officials and scientists at the time hypothesized that skin color and racial background influenced the body's reaction to chemical weapons. Specifically, the military conducted separate tests on African American, Japanese American, and Puerto Rican soldiers. Military scientists at the time were seeking answers to a biased question. Was black skin thicker or more resistant to mustard gas than white skin? They hoped that if black soldiers proved more resistant, they would be placed in frontline chemical units. However, the test results proved that mustard gas burned human skin equally regardless of race. Furthermore, Japanese American soldiers were also specifically targeted for testing. The military wanted to understand how these chemicals would affect Japan's enemies in the Pacific Theater, so they used their own Japanese citizens as mock enemy models. The impact of these experiments was far-reaching. Many soldiers developed chronic health problems ranging from severe asthma and emphysema to skin cancer and leukemia in their later years. However, for decades, they were denied proper medical care by the government because of their oath of secrecy. They were threatened with court-martial if they revealed the experiments to anyone, including their personal physicians. As a result, the causes of their illnesses went undiagnosed for years. After the end of World War II, United States military strategy shifted significantly. Entering the Cold War, the focus of weapons research was no longer limited to agents that caused physical damage, such as burns, but expanded to weapons that affected the nervous system and psychological well-being. The center of this new research was Edgewood Arsenal, a military facility located in Maryland. Between 1955 and 1975, the U.S. Army Chemical Corps ran a secret medical testing program involving approximately 7,000 soldiers. The recruitment process for these subjects became one of the most problematic points. Commanders promised incentives such as exemption from routine duties, extra weekends off, and medals to those who volunteered. However, these soldiers were not fully informed of the risks they would face. They signed consent forms without knowing the names of the substances or the side effects of the chemicals they would be injecting into their bodies. At Edgewood, military scientists had a specific goal. They wanted to develop an incapacitating agent. The theory of war was to create weapons that didn't kill the enemy, but left them too confused, hallucinated, or unconscious to fight. The first substances to be intensely tested were psychoactive agents and hallucinogens. One of the most prominent was LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide. Military doctors administered LSD in varying doses to soldiers, then placed them in simulated combat situations or interrogations. They wanted to see if soldiers under the influence of LSD could still obey orders, read maps, or keep secrets. The results were clinically documented. Soldiers experienced severe panic, loss of perception of reality, uncontrollable hysterical laughter, and paralyzing fear. Besides LSD, the military also tested a substance called BZ, 3-cunicidinyl benzylate. BZ was considered far more potent and dangerous than LSD. While the effects of LSD lasted a few hours, the effects of BZ could cause delirium or mental confusion that persisted for days. Subjects exposed to BZ often experienced complete amnesia about what happened while under the influence of the drug, while during the test they exhibited highly disorganized and self-threatening behavior. The second category of test subjects at Edgewood involved lethal nerve agents such as sarin and VX. Unlike hallucinogen tests, these involved a high risk of immediate death. The purpose of these tests was not to assess intoxication, but rather to test the effectiveness of antidotes and protective clothing. Soldiers were injected with small doses of nerve agents or asked to stand in a chamber filled with toxic vapors to observe physiological reactions, such as pupil constriction, difficulty breathing, and muscle spasms. One of the critical aspects of the Edgewood program was the lack of long-term health monitoring. After the experiments were completed, the soldiers were returned to their home units without any clear medical records of their exposure. Doctors at Edgewood did not follow up to determine whether the chemicals caused permanent brain damage, mental impairment, or subsequent physical illnesses. The soldiers' health records were left blank, as if the experiments had never occurred.
While the experiments at Edgewood Arsenal focused on individuals and mental manipulation on land, subsequent programs took these tests to a much more massive scale and a completely different environment, the high seas. This was the era of Project 112 and its naval component known as Project SH, or Shipboard Hazard and Defense.
Running from 1962 to 1973, Project SH was designed to answer a vital strategic question for the United States Department of Defense at the time. How vulnerable was America's warship fleet to an airborne biological or chemical weapon attack? At the time, military doctrine feared that an enemy could release a toxic cloud at sea capable of incapacitating an entire crew without physically damaging the ship itself. To simulate this scenario, the United States military used its own fleet of tugboats and destroyers as targets. These operations were conducted in various remote locations in the Pacific Ocean, including around the Hawaiian Islands and Johnston Atoll. The methods used were highly technical and structured. Military aircraft, typically A-4 Skyhawks or specialized spray craft, would fly downwind of the warship convoy. They would then release a payload of aerosols or fine particle fog. These artificial clouds were designed to be carried by the wind and envelop the target ships below. The sailors and Marines serving on these ships were rarely given any real information. Most were told that the activity was simply a routine exercise to test the deck watering system or a standard preparedness exercise. As a result, thousands of personnel continued their normal activities on the ship's decks, breathing contaminated air, even eating and sleeping in ship compartments whose ventilation had drawn these particles inside. The substances used in Project SH fell into two main categories: simulant agents and active agents. In most tests, the military used simulants, or biological or chemical substances considered harmless at the time, used to track the spread of toxic clouds. One of the most commonly used was the bacterium Bacillus glogigi. This bacterium was chosen because its spread characteristics were similar to those of deadly anthrax spores. In addition, they also used zinc-cadmium sulfide, a fluorescent particle that makes it easier to track the substance's distribution in the atmosphere. Although touted as safe in the 1960s, modern medical understanding proves otherwise. Exposure to high concentrations of Bacillus glogigi is known to cause acute infections in individuals with weakened immune systems. Meanwhile, the cadmium in zinc-cadmium sulfide is known to be carcinogenic or cancer-causing when accumulated in the human body, especially in the lungs. However, Project SH didn't stop at simulations. Declassified documents confirm that in some specific tests, the military used real weapons agents, deadly nerve agents like Sarin, GB, and VX, as well as active biological agents like Coxiella burnetii, the cause of Q fever, and Francisella tularensis, the cause of tularemia, were released into the marine environment. Although these tests with active agents were conducted with stricter protocols than the simulations, the risk of unexpected exposure due to changes in wind direction or equipment leaks remained a real threat to the ship's crew. Another highly dangerous aspect of the project was the decontamination procedure. After the ship was engulfed in a chemical or biological cloud, the crew was ordered to wash or decontaminate it. Without adequate high-level protective clothing, this cleaning process increased the risk of direct exposure. The sailors had to scrub surfaces contaminated with nerve agents or bacteria, putting them in direct contact with the residue of the hazardous substances. As with previous programs, no long-term medical records were kept of the sailors after the mission, leaving them in the dark for decades about what had actually entered their lungs in the middle of the ocean.
For years after these programs were discontinued, the truth about what happened remained firmly buried under the seal of state secret. Many veterans who began experiencing strange health problems, from chronic respiratory problems to cancer to degenerative neurological disorders, found themselves at a dead end in their search for answers. The Department of Defense consistently denied any connection between their ailments and their military service. It wasn't until the beginning of the new millennium, thanks to investigative pressure from journalists and the persistence of victims, that the veil of secrecy began to lift. Documents were declassified, and the Department of Veterans Affairs finally admitted that thousands of personnel had indeed been used as test subjects. Compensation and healthcare mechanisms began to open, but for many veterans, this recognition came too late. Many died or lived with permanent disabilities without ever knowing the true cause.